What happens when the husband you trusted most secretly plots to strip you of everything alongside his mistress? That's the brutal reality facing Mrs. Seraphina Washington. After her husband's death, his lover shows up with a will that turns Seraphina into a pauper in her own home. Her world collapses. But is that the whole story? Behind the obvious betrayal lies something far more complex, a midnight confession and a last-ditch strategy born of remorse. Does a wounded wife have the strength to carry out justice for herself? The Uninvited Queen. My name is Seraphina Washington. I am 62 years old. And for the last 15 years of my 35-year marriage, I was a ghost in my own home. I used to think that love was a fortress, but I learned that a fortress can become a prison. And the person you built it with can be the one who hands the keys to the enemy. The enemy arrived on a Tuesday. 1 week after Elijah's funeral, I was in the sunroom of our home on Chestnut Hill. The house Elijah had designed to be our forever. It was a place of glass and light, filled with the sprawling fiddle-leaf figs I had nurtured for decades. I was holding a cup of tea, the steam warming my hands, when I saw her car pull up the long, winding driveway. A sleek, black Mercedes that looked like a panther stalking its prey. It was Monique Dubois. She didn't ring the doorbell. She used a key. The sound of that key turning in the lock of my front door was louder than any shout. It was the sound of an invasion. I stood up, my tea growing cold in my hands. She walked into the grand foyer as if she owned the place. Because, in her mind, she already did. She wasn't alone. Behind her were 2 large men and her lawyer. That same young man with the overly confident smile, Mr. Croft. He was holding a document like a shield. Seraphina, Monique said, her voice echoing in the marble hall. She didn't sound apologetic. She sounded bored, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience she had to deal with before she could start redecorating. I think you know why we're here. For 15 years, I had watched this woman slowly dismantle my life from the inside. It started with whispered phone calls. Then business trips Elijah went on without me. Soon, I was no longer invited to company galas. Then to holiday parties. My opinion on everything, from the company's direction to the color of the dining room walls, was quietly discarded. I was politely, methodically, erased. Elijah was still my husband. We still shared a roof. But the heart of our home had been hollowed out and given to her. I was the relic in the museum of our marriage. And now, the relic was being told to leave the building. Mr. Croft, Monique said, gesturing with a dismissive wave. Her lawyer stepped forward. He didn't offer condolences. He just read. He read from the last will and testament of my husband, Elijah Washington. He read that this house, with its soaring ceilings and sun-drenched room, was now hers. He read that the company I had helped build with my own sacrifices was now hers. He read that everything, every chair, every painting, every memory soaked into the floorboards was now hers. The 2 men she brought with her started walking through the living room, their heavy boots scuffing the polished oak floors. They were looking at the furniture, sizing it up. One of them touched the frame of a photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of my children when they were young. My children, my hands, resting by my sides, clenched into fists. The storm I had held inside for 15 years was finally breaking. The trembling wasn't from fear anymore. It was from rage. A cold, quiet rage that had been waiting for this exact moment. Monique watched me, a smirk on her lips. She was waiting for the tears, the pleading. She was expecting the grieving widow to collapse. She didn't know who I was. Not really. She didn't know what I had become during those 15 years in the shadows. She thought she was here for a coronation, an easy victory. She didn't understand that you don't just walk into a queen's castle and take her throne. Not while the queen is still standing, not without a fight. And the weapon I was about to use was one she never saw coming. It wasn't rage or tears. It was a truth, sealed and waiting, that would shatter her world completely. The fading scent of sandalwood. 35 years is a long time to build a life with someone. It's long enough for the roots of 2 trees to grow together. So intertwined, you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. Our life was like that. Solid, deep. Elijah and I, we were a fortress. I remember the early days, The smell of sawdust that clung to him after a long day at his first architecture firm. The way his hand, large and calloused, would find mine in the dark of a movie theater. His laugh wasn't loud, but it was deep, a rumbling sound that made you feel safe, like the engine of a sturdy ship. Every morning, for as long as I can remember, he smelled of two things: coffee and sandalwood. It was his aftershave, a simple, clean scent. It was the smell of my husband. It was the smell of home. I'd breathe it in when he kissed me goodbye, and it would linger in the air for a few moments after he left. A quiet promise that he would be back. Love, after 3 decades, isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small, sacred rituals. It's the pot roast he loved, the one I'd start in the morning so the house would be filled with the smell when he came home. It's the way he always knew when my feet were cold and would move them into his lap while we read the Sunday paper. It's a language spoken without words, a symphony played in comfortable silence. And then, one day, the music began to change. It wasn't a sudden crash. It was more like one instrument, slowly, quietly, falling out of tune. The change started about 2 years ago. At first, it was things so small I told myself I was imagining them. He started working late more often. That was understandable. The firm was growing. But then he would come home and head straight for the shower, something he never used to do. He always liked to sit with me first, to unwind. Then came the phone calls. He'd be in his study, the door slightly ajar. I'd walk past on my way to the kitchen, and I would hear his voice change. It would drop, become softer. "Get her." If I paused in the hallway, the conversation would abruptly end. A click. Silence. When I'd walk in a moment later, he would be staring at his computer screen, his shoulders tight. "Everything all right?" "Honey," I'd ask. "Fine." He'd say, not looking at me. "Just a difficult client." But it didn't feel fine. It felt foreign. The first real piece of evidence was a single strand of hair. It was long and blonde, the color of champagne. I found it on the collar of his dark wool coat one evening as I was hanging it up. My hair is black, cut short. Our daughter's hair is a deep brown, just like his. This strand of hair belonged to a stranger. I held it between my thumb and forefinger under the hallway light. It seemed to glow. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't say anything. I just pulled it off the coat, dropped it in the trash, and washed my hands. I washed them for a long time, but the real sign, the one my heart couldn't ignore, was the sandalwood. One evening, he came home and kissed me at the door, just like always. But something was missing. His scent, the clean, woody smell that had been the backdrop to our life together, was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something sweeter, more floral, something that didn't belong in our home. It was the scent of another woman's perfume. Faint, but it was there. That night, lying in bed next to him, I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. The man whose breathing I knew as well as my own suddenly felt like an intruder in our life. The space between us in the bed, once a place of comfort, now felt like a vast, empty canyon. It wasn't another woman's perfume that haunted me in the weeks that followed. It was the absence of his. It was the slow, creeping silence where a symphony once played. It was the realization that the fortress we had built over 35 years had been breached, not by an army with cannons, but by a quiet thief in the night. And I, its loyal watchman, had been sleeping at my post. The art of the hunt. I remember the first time I saw her. Her name was Monique Dubois, the woman in the cream-colored suit. But back then, she was just a face in a crowd. It was at a gallery opening downtown, one of those events Elijah had to attend for work. The air was thick with the smell of white wine and ambition. I was never comfortable at those things. I felt like a history book in a room full of magazines. But Elijah, he belonged. People were drawn to his quiet confidence. She approached us near a large, abstract sculpture that looked like a car wreck painted blue. She moved with a kind of deliberate grace, like a cat navigating a room full of fragile things. She introduced herself as an art broker, an admirer of Elijah's work. Her flattery was a work of art in itself. It wasn't cheap or obvious. It was intelligent. She spoke about his use of light and space in the new library project. She quoted an article about him from an architectural journal. She made him feel seen, not just as a successful man, but as an artist. My husband, who had been feeling the strain of his work for months, drank it in like a thirsty man finding water. I watched her. I have spent my life studying history, which is really just the study of people, their motivations, their strategies. I saw in her a masterful tactician. She wasn't flirting with my husband. She was interviewing him for a position, the position of her benefactor. Soon, she became a fixture in the background of our lives. A professional friendship, Elijah called it. She'd call him with tips about art pieces for his clients. She'd arrange to have coffee near his office to discuss a new artist. She was creating a space for herself in his world. A space that had nothing to do with me, or our home, or our 35 years of shared history. She positioned herself as his intellectual equal, his confidant. She understood the pressures he was under. She'd say, the burden of running a company, of being a creative mind in a corporate world. She made him feel that his weariness was a noble struggle, and that she was the only one who truly understood its weight. It was a classic siege. First, you isolate the fortress. Then, you convince its king that you are his only ally. I will never forget the night he invited her to our home for dinner. Just the three of us. He said it was important for me to get to know her, to see how valuable she was to his work. I made his favorite pot roast. The irony was not lost on me. She arrived with an expensive bottle of wine and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She complimented the house. Of course. My home. She walked through the living room, her fingers lightly trailing over the furniture, over the frames of the paintings we had collected over the years. I watched her eyes. She wasn't admiring our life. She was appraising it. It was the gaze of an auctioneer, not a guest. During dinner, she directed all her attention to Elijah. She would ask him a question, then turn to me and say something like, "It must be so difficult for you, Seraphina, to have him working so hard." It was a clever move. On the surface, it was inclusive, but its real purpose was to define my role. I was the wife at home, worrying. She was the colleague out in the world, understanding. After dinner, while I was clearing the plates, I saw her standing in front of the small landscape painting that hung over our fireplace. It was the first piece of real art we ever bought together. A memory of a trip to Maine when we were young and had very little money. It was worth almost nothing. But to me, it was priceless. "That's a lovely piece," she said, without turning around. "The artist has some potential, but he never quite broke through. A shame." And in that moment, I understood everything. She saw the world not in terms of love, or memory, or beauty, but in terms of value. What would appreciate, what would not. To her, my husband was not a man to be loved. He was an asset to be acquired. She played her part perfectly. The admiring protege, the sympathetic friend. I often wonder if I was the only one who saw the predator behind her smile. Have you ever had that feeling? That deep gut instinct telling you someone isn't what they seem? Let me know in the comments below. Sometimes, just knowing you weren't alone in seeing it makes all the difference. A covenant in the rain. The moment everything changed didn't happen in the bright, sterile light of a lawyer's office. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, 3 months before Elijah died. A storm was raging outside. The kind of storm that makes a house feel like a ship lost at sea. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the tall windows of our bedroom. I was reading in bed. Elijah had been quiet all evening. A heavy, suffocating silence that was worse than any argument. He stood by the window for a long time, just watching the storm. His shoulders, which had always seemed so broad and strong, were slumped. He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for any single soul to bear. Finally, he turned to me. His face was pale in the dim lamplight, and his eyes were filled with a kind of brokenness I hadn't seen since the day his father passed. He walked over to the bed, but he didn't get in. He knelt on the floor beside me. A gesture so foreign, so humbling. It stole the breath from my lungs. He took my hand, the one not holding my book. His own was cold, trembling. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry." And then he began to talk. The words came out in a torrent, like the rain against the glass. He told me everything, not just about the affair, the things I already knew, the things I had pieced together from years of cold shoulders and silent dinners. He told me how Monique had woven her web around him, so skillfully, so patiently. He told me how she had convinced him that my love for him had faded into simple habit, how my quiet strength was not support, but indifference, how she had made him believe that she was the only one who saw the brilliant architect, while I only saw the aging husband. He cried, not loudly, but with the silent, wrenching sobs of a man who has finally looked in the mirror and seen a stranger. I did not cry. The tears had run out long ago, leaving behind a dry, etching quiet inside me. I listened. I listened as the man I had loved for 35 years confessed how he had let a thief into our house, not to steal our silver, but to steal our story. When he finished, the only sound in the room was the storm and his ragged breathing. He was waiting for me to scream, to rage, to throw him out. A part of me wanted to, the part that was still the young girl who had fallen in love with a brilliant, ambitious boy. But that girl was long gone. In her place was a woman who understood that some things were beyond repair. I gently pulled my hand from his. I closed my book and set it on the nightstand. "Elijah," I said, and my voice was steadier than I thought it would be. "Forgiveness is a conversation for another lifetime. That ship has sailed. Tonight, we are not husband and wife." He looked up, his face a mask of confusion and despair. "Tonight," I continued, leaning forward, my voice low and clear, "we are architects, and we have one last fortress to build." A flicker of the old Elijah returned to his eyes. The planner, the builder. He understood. This wasn't about saving our marriage. This was about saving our legacy. He got up from the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, his mind already working. He was the one who knew the laws, the loopholes, the intricate dance of assets and estates. I had the will, the unbending resolve. But he had the blueprint. He explained how the family trust we had established years ago was our shield, an ironclad defense we had built in happier times, never imagining we would use it against an internal threat. And then he proposed the masterstroke, the weapon. "We let her think she's won," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "We create a new will, one that gives her everything on the surface, everything that isn't in the trust." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "It will be my final act, a confession and a condemnation, all in one." We let her walk into the castle, only to find the throne room is empty. And so, under the howl of the storm, a covenant was made, not of love, but of purpose. It was a strange, heartbreaking alliance, born from the ashes of our marriage. We were two partners, working on one last project together, to protect the house we had built, not just of brick and mortar, but of a lifetime of work, family, and a love that, even in its ruin, was still worth defending. The first stone cast, the silence in room 3B, was a living thing. It pressed in on my ears, heavy and suffocating. It tasted of old paper and the cheap perfume of a premature victory. Mr. Croft, Monique's lawyer, shuffled his papers with an air of theatrical finality. The reading was done. The spoils had been declared. The queen was dead. Long live the queen. Monique let the silence sit for a long moment, savoring it. I could feel her watching me, waiting. She wanted me to feel the full, crushing weight of my new reality. A widow, a footnote in my own husband's story, dismissed with a hollow apology. She was waiting for the tears, the righteous anger, the helpless plea. She wanted a performance to validate her conquest. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished mahogany that reflected her pale, triumphant face. She gave me a look that was meant to be pity, but it was just condescension wearing a softer, more insulting mask. "Well, Seraphina," she said, her voice smooth as cream, each word chosen to sound like a gentle dismissal. "I suppose there's not much left to say." Her words hung in the air. This was my cue, the moment the curtain was supposed to fall on my life. My cue to stand up, defeated and diminished, to offer a few weak, broken words of protest before fading away into a quiet, lonely future. To be the dignified, heartbroken wife she had read about in novels. A tragic figure to be pitied and then promptly forgotten. I thought of Elijah. I thought of our conversation in the rain. I thought of the promise we made. We are architects, and we have one last fortress to build. I reached for the glass of water in front of me. The ice had melted. The water was lukewarm, tasteless. I felt the cool, smooth glass against my fingertips. A small, solid anchor in the swirling currents of the room. My hands were perfectly steady now. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a cold, hard calm, the kind of calm that comes after the worst has already happened, and you are left only with what must be done. I set the glass down on the cork coaster. I did it slowly, deliberately. The soft, dull thump was the only sound in the room. I lifted my eyes from the table and met her gaze directly. On the contrary, Ms. Dubois, I said. My voice did not shake. It was not loud. It was level and clear, and it cut through the heavy, self-satisfied silence like a shard of glass. There is everything left to say, a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or just surprise passed over her face before she could smooth it away. She was a master of control, but for a split second, the mask slipped. She had expected grief, not defiance. She settled back in her chair, crossing her legs, the queen, momentarily startled, but still on her throne, indulging a peasant's final, pointless plea. I did not look at her again. She had taken up enough of my life. I turned my head to the man sitting beside me, Charles Davies. He has been our family's lawyer for 40 years. Since my father's time. He is a quiet man, with eyes that have seen the best and worst of people. And he has learned to tell the difference. He had sat through the entire reading without a single change in his expression, a rock of stillness next to my own. He was not just my lawyer, he was my witness, and he was waiting for my signal. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Our covenant, Charles, I said, my voice still quiet. But now it was the quiet of a general giving a long-awaited command. Please present the documents pertaining to the Washington Family Trust. Established in 2008, the name just hung there in the still air. The Washington Family Trust. It was a simple phrase, composed of ordinary words, but in that room, it felt like an incantation. A spell spoken to change the very nature of reality. Monique's lawyer, Mr. Croft, frowned slightly, a genuine look of professional confusion on his face. He tilted his head, searching his memory. It was clear the name meant nothing to him. Monique's perfect expression didn't change, but her posture did. She stiffened, a subtle, almost invisible tightening of the muscles in her shoulders. It was the reaction of a predator that has been hunting in an open field, only to suddenly sense the metallic click of a hidden trap. Charles Davies reached down to the worn leather briefcase at his feet. It was a case he had carried for decades, its surface cracked and softened with age, like the back of a wise old tortoise. He placed it on the table and unlatched it with two loud, metallic snaps that echoed in the quiet room. From it, he retrieved a single, thick binder, bound in dark blue leather, its corners reinforced with brass. It was not a document, it was a statement. He placed the binder in the exact center of the table, equidistant from all of us. It landed with a solid, heavy thud. The sound seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the room. It was not a sound of defeat, it was the sound of the first stone being cast, the sound of a foundation, deep and unshakable, being laid bare for all to see. I finally allowed myself to look at Monique's face again. I watched her as she stared at the blue binder. Her perfect, confident mask did not fall. Not yet. But for the very first time, I saw a crack, a tiny, hairline fracture of doubt, right between her carefully sculpted eyebrows. The fortress of paper. The silence in room 3B was no longer just an absence of sound. It had become a presence, a heavy, watchful thing that I had summoned, letting it steep like strong tea until it was dark and bitter. Monique's triumphant smile had frozen on her face, turning brittle. My calm, the unnatural stillness of a deep lake before a storm, was beginning to unravel her. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to my lawyer. Charles Davies. He was an old friend, a man whose children had grown up with mine, whose wife and I had shared countless cups of coffee over decades of life's small joys and quiet sorrows. He knew this wasn't just about assets. He knew he was the custodian of a life's final, painful act of preservation. He understood the weight of this moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio that had been sitting in front of him. The soft rustle of aged paper was the only sound, yet it felt like a gavel coming down. It was the sound of the real proceedings finally beginning. "Mr. Croft," he began, his voice calm and measured, like a professor starting a lecture he knew by heart. "While we do not contest the validity of the document you have just read, it appears to be operating on incomplete information. Its jurisdiction is limited." Monique's lawyer, the young Mr. Croft, frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Limited? What are you talking about? It's his last will and testament, signed and witnessed. It's final." "Indeed," Charles said smoothly, the word hanging in the air. "It is final. It dictates the disposition of all assets personally owned by Mr. Elijah Washington at the time of his death. However, it seems your client was not made aware of a pre-existing legal structure, specifically the Washington Family Irrevocable Trust, established on May 14th, 2008. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. It glided silent, an emissary from the past, and came to a stop directly in front of Mr. Croft. Monique leaned forward, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together. "A trust. What trust? Elijah never mentioned a trust." Her voice held a note of accusation, as if he had deliberately kept a secret from her. The irony was almost too much to bear. "A fortress," I said, speaking for the first time since they had arrived. My voice was low, and it seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "A fortress made of paper." Mr. Croft picked up the document. His confident smirk was gone, melted away, and replaced by a line of intense concentration between his brows. I watched his eyes scan the text. Once, then a second time. He was a quick study. I had to give him that. I could see the moment the truth dawned on him. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, sinking realization. It was a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of his jaw, a slight loss of color in his cheeks that no amount of professional composure could hide. Charles continued, his tone relentlessly neutral, like the voice of a GPS announcing a route change. "As you can see, 15 years ago, Mr. and Mrs. Washington transferred certain key assets into the trust. Its terms, as the name implies, are irrevocable. The assets placed within it are no longer the personal property of the grantors. They belong to the trust itself. The beneficiaries are, and have always been, Mrs. Seraphina Washington and her children." He paused, letting the weight of the word irrevocable settle in the room. It was a beautiful word. Final. Unbreakable. "The property on Chestnut Hill," he said, and I pictured my roses, blooming faithfully by the stone wall, was transferred to the trust in 2008. The controlling shares of Washington Architectural, which constitute the majority of the company's value, also transferred in 2008. The vacation home on Martha's Vineyard, where our children spent their summers. The art collection Elijah and I built together, piece by piece. The primary investment portfolios. He ticked off the items as if reading a grocery list. Each one was a brick being laid in a wall right in front of Monique's face. A wall she couldn't climb, couldn't break down, couldn't even see until she had run straight into it at full speed. Mr. Croft looked up from the paper, his expression a mixture of shock and professional embarrassment. He began shuffling through his own briefcase, a frantic, useless gesture. He had been sent into a battle without knowing the terrain. He had been handed a map that was 15 years out of date. He knew he had lost. He just hadn't figured out how to tell his client, the queen whose coronation he was supposed to be overseeing. But Monique didn't need to be told. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. A raw, ugly sound in the quiet room. Her face, once so composed and cool, was a mask of disbelief and rising fury. The smooth veneer had cracked. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice sharp and shrill. Losing all its cultivated grace, she slammed her hand down on the table. The sound echoed, a startling crack of violence in the stuffy legal air. "It's a trick, some legal nonsense you cooked up after he died." She turned her full, venomous glare on me, her eyes burning with a hate that was terrifyingly real. "Elijah wouldn't do this to me. He loved me." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the raw, desperate greed stripped bare of all its elegant disguises. I saw the panic of a gambler who had bet everything on a single hand, only to see the dealer reveal an unbeatable card. In that moment, I felt no pity. I only felt a profound, weary sadness for the years my husband had wasted on something so hollow. I met her furious gaze without flinching. My voice, when I spoke, was as cold and clear as ice. "He loved his family more," I said, "and he knew, better than anyone, what needed to be protected, not for you, but from you." The final testament. Monique's rage was a fire with nowhere to go. It was trapped behind her clenched jaw and the two bright, angry spots on her cheeks. She was vibrating with it. The fortress of paper had stopped her cold, and she was left sputtering in the ruins of her perfect plan. This is an insult," she finally managed to say, her voice tight and low. She glared at Charles Davies, then at me. "Elijah would never do this. You people coerced him when he was sick." Her lawyer, Mr. Croft, wisely put a hand on her arm. "Monique, perhaps we should discuss this privately." She shook him off. "No, I want to hear it. I want to hear how this woman," she pointed a trembling finger at me, "thinks she can erase Elijah's final wishes." I felt a deep weariness settle over me. Not anger, just a profound sadness for the sheer waste of it all. I looked at Charles, and he understood. It was time. "There is one final addendum to the reading," he said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through her fury. "A video testament, recorded by Mr. Washington 3 weeks before his passing." He gestured to a large screen on the wall that had, until now, been dark. He pressed a button on a small remote. The screen flickered to life, and there he was, my husband, Elijah. My breath caught in my throat. I had prepared for this moment, but seeing him again, so alive and yet so fragile, was like a physical blow. He was propped up in the bed from his hospice room, the one we had set up in his old study overlooking the garden. He was thinner than I had ever seen him, the strong lines of his face softened by illness. But his eyes were clear. They were the eyes of the man I had married, lucid and full of a terrible, quiet sorrow. He was looking directly into the camera. He was looking at us. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the projector. Even Monique was frozen, her mouth slightly open, staring at the ghost on the screen. "If you are watching this," Elijah began, his voice a dry rasp, but steady, "it means that things have proceeded as I expected." He took a slow sip of water from a glass just out of frame. "For the last year of my life," he continued, "I was not the man my wife married. I was lost. I was a weak man, blinded by a reflection of what I thought I wanted, an illusion of youth, of admiration, a fantasy." He paused, and his eyes seemed to find mine. "Even through the lens, Seraphina," he said, and my name on his lips was a prayer. "I am sorry. My greatest failure was not my infidelity. It was forgetting, for a time, the strength and grace of the woman who stood by me. Always." I felt a tear escape and trace a cold path down my cheek. I did not wipe it away. He then turned his gaze, and it felt as though he was looking right at Monique. "To Ms. Dubois," he said, and his voice lost its warmth, becoming clinical. "Persist. I have no doubt that you believe you are my chosen heir. You are holding a will that says as much." He took a deep breath. "That will," he said, each word landing like a judge's gavel, "was my final test for you. A test of character. A test she has. As I predicted. Failed spectacularly. A small, sharp gasp escaped Monique's lips. The sound was swallowed by the silence. I needed to know. Elijah went on, his voice filled with a weary wisdom. If there was any genuine affection in you, or if it was only the assets you cared for, if you truly loved me, the contents of that will would not matter. But I knew your nature. I knew you would bring it here today like a trophy. I gave you the key to a treasure chest. Knowing full well the chest was empty, he leaned back against the pillows. Looking exhausted by the confession, my real legacy, he said, is not in buildings or bank accounts. It is in my family, the family I almost threw away. The fortress that Seraphina, in her infinite wisdom, reminded me we needed to protect. The Washington family trust is that fortress. It stands. It is untouchable. It is my real will. The video ended. His image faded, leaving the screen dark and empty. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a tomb. I looked at Monique. The fire was gone from her eyes. The anger, the defiance, all of it had vanished. All that was left was a hollow, gaping emptiness. Her carefully constructed world, her entire sense of self as the woman who had won, had been dismantled in 3 minutes by the ghost of the man she thought she controlled. Tears began to well in her eyes, not tears of grief, but of pure, unadulterated humiliation. They spilled over, tracing clean paths through her expensive foundation. She was shattered. That was the moment the truth was finally laid bare, not by legal documents, but by the confession of a dying man. If you are still listening, if you have come this far with me, please help me by commenting with the number 1 below, so I know that I still have companions on this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part, the part where I finally begin to find my own peace. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn. Enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat. The echo of a name. The video ended. The screen went black, but the image of Elijah's face, etched with pain and regret, lingered in the air. The room was utterly still. Even the city traffic outside seemed to have paused in deference to the weight of what had just transpired. Monique sat frozen in her chair, a statue carved from disbelief. The tears that had streamed down her face had stopped, leaving shiny tracks on her skin. She wasn't sobbing anymore. She was just empty. All the fight, all the fire, had been extinguished. I thought that was the end. The final, crushing blow. The plan we had laid out on that rainy night had been executed. The fortress had held. I felt a slow, deep weariness settle into my bones. The exhaustion that comes after a long, drawn-out war. I was ready for it to be over. But Charles Davies didn't move to turn on the lights. He simply looked at the dark screen. Then at me. There was something in his eyes. A gentle knowledge that told me there was one more piece to this. One final echo. On the screen, Elijah's voice spoke again. This time over the blackness. It was just his voice now, clear and disembodied. Like a memory-given sound. There is one last thing, he said. And the voice was softer now, stripped of all its legal formality. The few personal assets that remain outside the trust, my car, the contents of my personal bank account, my collection of architectural books, they are not much in the grand scheme of things, but they are mine to give. I frowned. We hadn't discussed this part. This was a postscript he had written alone. It was my life's work to build things. His voice continued, filled with a quiet melancholy, buildings that would stand the test of time. I failed to do the same with my own character, but perhaps, with this last act, I can build something small that will last, something that honors what was always good and true in my life. There was a pause. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing on the recording. And so, he declared, his voice finding a final reserve of strength. All remaining personal assets will be liquidated and used to establish a scholarship for underprivileged history students at the University of Pennsylvania. It will be named. He paused again, and in that split second, I held my breath. It will be named the Seraphina Washington Scholarship Fund, in honor of the woman whose strength was my true north, even when I was lost in the storm. The name, my name, It hit me with a force that nothing else that day had. Not the lies. Not the confrontation. Not the victory. My own name, spoken by him, echoing in that silent room. It wasn't an apology. It was more than that. It was an acknowledgement, a tribute. It was a piece of him reaching across the void to take my hand and say, "I see you. I always saw you," for the first time all day. My carefully constructed composure threatened to crack. My eyes stung. The trembling in my hands returned. But this time, it wasn't from rage or anxiety. It was from a wave of emotion so complex I couldn't begin to name it. It was grief and gratitude, anger and a strange, heartbreaking kind of love, all tangled together. The scholarship, it was perfect. It was a nod to my own career, my own passions, the life I had before I was just Elijah Washington's wife. It was him giving back a piece of my identity that had been slowly eroded over the years. I looked at Monique. She didn't react. The name meant nothing to her. She was so focused on the money, on the buildings and the stocks, that she couldn't understand the value of this. She couldn't see that this small act, this echo of a name, was the most valuable inheritance of all. Her defeat was now absolute. Not just because she had lost the fortune, but because she could never comprehend the wealth she had been fighting for. The recording ended with a soft click. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. For the first time in over 15 years, I felt the ghost of his hand in mine. Not as a husband, but as a partner. We had finished what we started, and he had written a final, beautiful sentence to our story, all on his own. The Unmaking of a Queen. No one spoke for a long time after the screen went dark. The silence in room 3B was a different kind now. It wasn't the tense, brittle silence of before. This was a heavy, deep silence, the kind that falls after a storm has passed. When the sky is washed clean, and the only sound is the dripping of rain from the eaves. The truth, once revealed, is a force of nature. It scours the landscape clean, leaving no room for argument, no shelter for lies. Monique's lawyer, Mr. Croft, was the first to stir. He began packing his sleek, modern briefcase, his movements stiff and awkward. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a kind of professional embarrassment. He avoided looking at anyone, focusing on the precise alignment of his papers. He had come here this morning expecting a simple, profitable victory, a straightforward execution of a will. Instead, he had been made an unwilling participant in the public dismantling of his own client. He murmured something to Monique, a legal whisper about options, about appeals, about next steps, but his heart wasn't in it. His voice was flat. He knew, as we all knew, that there were no next steps. The game was over. Monique herself seemed frozen in her chair, a statue carved from ice. The tears on her face had begun to dry, leaving faint, shiny tracks through her expensive makeup. Her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. She was staring at the dark screen, at the empty space where Elijah's face had been. It was as if she were hoping he might reappear, that he might laugh and tell her it was all a terrible, elaborate mistake. But the screen remained empty, a dark mirror reflecting her own shattered expression. Finally, with a shuddering breath that seemed to take all her effort, she stood up. Her movements were slow, robotic. All the fluid, predatory grace she had possessed was gone, replaced by a brittle fragility. Like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and hastily glued back together, she reached down and picked up her expensive handbag from the floor, clutching it to her chest like a shield. But she did not look at me. She could not. To look at me would be to acknowledge the totality of her defeat, to admit that the woman she had dismissed as a relic had been the architect of her undoing. She walked towards the door. Her confident, clicking stride had been replaced by a slow, dragging shuffle. Her shoulders, once held so high and proud, were slumped. Her spine, once so straight and defiant, now seemed curved under an invisible weight. It was the posture of a soldier surrendering a long-held banner. She had walked in a queen. Ready for her coronation, she walked out a ghost. The heavy door of the conference room clicked shut behind her. The sound, so small, echoed with a profound finality. And then, there were just two of us, me, And Charles Davies, he sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle again. Then, he began to gather the documents of the Washington Family Trust. His hands, usually so precise and businesslike, moved with a kind of gentle reverence. He placed the thick blue binder, our fortress of paper, back into his old leather briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The battle was over. The fortress had held. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, so profound it was a physical weight. It felt as if every muscle in my body, every nerve I had held taut for over a year, had suddenly gone slack. I had been holding my breath. I had been standing watch on the castle walls for so long. I had forgotten what it felt like to be at peace, to simply exist without a threat on the horizon. Now, in the quiet aftermath, all the tension, all the grief and anger I had held at bay came flooding back, not as a storm, but as a slow, tired tide, receding and leaving me empty on the shore. Charles looked at me, his old, kind eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond legal statutes and contracts. He had known me since I was a girl. When my father first brought me to this very office, he had seen my wedding photos. He had held my children when they were babies, marveling at their tiny hands. He had been a silent witness to my whole life, its triumphs and its deepest sorrows. He would be proud of you, Seraphina, he said, his voice soft, but firm. I could only nod. The words were caught in my throat, a nod of unshed tears and unspoken gratitude. Proud. It was a complicated word. I was proud of the strength I had found, the strength I never knew I possessed. But the victory felt hollow, a prize won from a war that should never have been fought. Born of so much pain and betrayal, there were no winners in that room, only survivors. He stood and helped me with my coat, his touch gentle on my arm. As I pushed my arms through the familiar sleeves, I felt his hand rest on my shoulder for just a moment. It was not a gesture of pity, but of solidarity, a small, solid gesture of friendship that meant more than any legal victory. I walked out of the conference room, my own steps feeling unsteady. I moved down the long, quiet hallway, its carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps. The elevator ride down from the 10th floor felt like a slow descent from another world, a world of shadows and strategy, back to the sunlit world of the living. When the polished brass doors opened, the bright, noisy reality of a Philadelphia afternoon hit me. The sudden blare of a car horn, the indistinct but constant chatter of people on the sidewalk, the smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor's cart, a smell that was suddenly, overwhelmingly, wonderful. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the old stone building and stepped out onto the street. The air had never felt so fresh. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the cool, crisp autumn air. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in years. The weight on my chest, the one I had carried for so long I had forgotten it was there, had finally, blessedly, lifted. The war was over. The fortress was secure. My family was safe. But as I stood there on the busy sidewalk, watching the world rush by in a blur of color and motion, a new, daunting question settled into the quiet, empty space in my heart. The question that comes after every long battle is won, after the swords are put away and the silence descends. What now? A garden of my own. It has been 6 months since that day in room 3B. Autumn has given way to the deep, quiet sleep of winter, and winter is now softening into the first tender promises of spring. I am in my garden, the one behind the house on Chestnut Hill. My house. The afternoon sun is warm on my back, a gentle, healing warmth that seems to seep right into my bones. The earth, still damp from the melted snow, smells rich and alive, a scent of patience and potential. I am pruning the roses, my hands protected by old, worn leather gloves, the same ones I've used for years. The thorns are sharp, but I know how to handle them now. I know you must be firm, respectful of their power, but unafraid to cut away what is dead to make way for what is to come. I think about that day often, not with the sharp sting of anger anymore, or even with the cold, brittle satisfaction of victory. I think of it with a kind of quiet clarity, the way a historian looks back at a pivotal event. Not to judge, but to understand its lessons. The echoes of that room have faded, replaced by the gentler sounds of my life now, the whistle of a kettle, the rustle of turning pages, the laughter of my grandchildren when they visit more often now. My children. We sit at the big oak table in the kitchen, the one with 100 tiny scratches, each a ghost of a childhood memory, and we talk, really talk. The silence that had grown between us during Elijah's last years, the careful tiptoeing around the unspoken, is gone. I showed them the video of their father. It was the hardest thing I've done since his funeral. We sat together in the den, the three of us, and watched him confess his weakness and find his strength. There were tears, of course, but they were tears of complexity, of grief for the man he was, and a strange, sad pride for the man he chose to be at the very end. They needed to see it, not to tarnish his memory, but to make it whole. To understand that a person's life is not a single, flawless narrative. It's a messy, complicated book, filled with beautiful chapters and some very painful ones. The final chapter doesn't erase what came before, but it can change the meaning of the entire story. That is the first lesson I hope they carry with them, the one I pass from my generation to theirs. I want them to know that the greatest inheritance a parent can leave is not a portfolio of stocks locked away in a trust, but the integrity of their actions. Elijah stumbled badly. He lost his way in a fog of vanity and foolishness, but in his final, clear-eyed act, he taught our children the most valuable lesson of all, that it is never, ever too late to do the right thing. He showed them that true strength isn't about never falling, it's about how you choose to land, and what you try to build from the wreckage. And for my children, as they navigate their own lives and families, I hope they understand something else I learned in the long, quiet years of my vigil, that loyalty to a family is not blind silence. It is not ignoring the cracks in the foundation, plastering over them with polite smiles and holiday dinners, until the whole house falls down. True loyalty is protecting the core values of that family: honesty, respect, dignity, even when it means confronting the painful truths about the people you love the most. It is the courage to look at each other and say, "This is not who we are," and then doing the hard, painful work to make it right. I snip a dead, brittle branch from a rose bush. It falls to the earth with a soft snap, making way for new, green growth. My thoughts drift, unexpectedly, to Monique. I heard through the grapevine of old friends that she left Philadelphia, sold the car and the few books Elijah left her, the crumbs from a feast she never got to taste, and disappeared. I no longer feel the sharp edges of anger when I think of her. Instead, I feel a kind of distant, abstract sadness. I see her as a cautionary tale, a product of our modern world, a world that moves so fast and shines so brightly. In this life, we are so often obsessed with the idea of having the assets, having the status, having the perfect partner, having the life that looks so good on the outside. Monique believed she could simply have our life. She saw it as a prize, a thing to be acquired. She put a price on it, and she was willing to pay with manipulation and deceit. But she forgot a fundamental truth, one that you don't learn in a boardroom or an art gallery. The most valuable things in this world are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be cultivated. I run my gloved hand along a new, green shoot, feeling the delicate, tightly furled bud at its tip. It holds the promise of a deep red bloom, like this garden. Things like love and honor, and that quiet, sturdy thing we call inner peace, they cannot be seized. You cannot trick them into belonging to you. They require time, they require patience, and they require hands that are not afraid to get dirty, to pull the weeds, to work the soil, to tend to the roots day after day, year after year, through seasons of bloom and seasons of dormancy. Monique only wanted the flower. She never understood the work it took, the life it took, to make it bloom. A gentle breeze rustles the new leaves on the old oak tree at the edge of the lawn. It sounds like a soft sigh of relief. I stand up, stretching my back, and look at the house. My home. It looks the same as it always has, strong and beautiful against the afternoon sky, its windows catching the golden light. But it feels different. The air inside feels lighter. The quiet is no longer heavy with unspoken words. It is peaceful. It feels entirely mine again. The fortress of paper was secure. Elijah had seen to that. But I realize now that his greatest gift to me was not the protection of our asset. It was the permission to finally stop guarding the past and start living for myself. He untied the knots that had bound me to his mistakes. And in doing so, he set me free. I smile. A real, easy smile that reaches my eyes. There is no audience here. Just me. The warm sun. The patient earth. And the quiet promise of the roses. Now, it was time to tend to my own garden. And with that, Seraphina Washington's story comes to a close. What did you think of Seraphina's final decision? Would you have done anything differently in her place? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. I truly do read every single one. If this story made you think or made you feel, don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone you believe it will resonate with. And subscribe to Unmaking Stories so you won't miss the mysteries that lie ahead. I'll see you in the next story, and who knows? Next time, the story might just be about you. Part 1, The Uninvited Queen. Part 2, The Fading Scent of Sandalwood. Part 3, The Art of the Hunt.